That was For the World to Dictate Our Death. Vredesburg. We just did a Google Translate on that, and it sounded like a Midwestern accent.
Yeah.
Vredesburg. Lepers Among Us, and then, of course, we started off with Progenies of the Great Apocalypse. So anything about any of those songs that sort of jump out to you, like in terms, we talked a lot about Progenies last time. I know the Vredesburg song had a lot of Arcturicisms to it.
Sure.
In terms of the riffing patterns and stuff. I think would you say that this is the record that Galder really kind of starts to take over in terms of some of the lead playing? Or, not that he was bad on the other records he was on, but...
More of an identity.
Well, I think this is the record where he becomes into his own.
Okay.
Because I think that, it's him and Shagrath or Steen writing a lot of the material. So I think in this record he wrote something like 6 songs, or almost 6 songs. So I think that of these 6 songs that he wrote are some of his strongest material. And I'm talking about whether it's his material for Dimmu, whether it's material for Old Man's Child, of any era. I think this is probably his most inspired. And I think that you hear it, right? You can hear it in the way the riffs come out.
His enthusiasm in the videos.
Yeah.
Well, he's always had a particular enthusiasm.
He's kind of a goofy guy, yeah.
Yeah, he's a funny dude.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that Tom or Galder, his name's Tom, has in this record, especially on the 6 songs that he wrote, are some of his strongest.
And what's kind of interesting too, like that last song we just heard, For the World to Dictate Our Death, one of the things you hear a lot, you heard it in Allegiance, which we opened with as well, is there's a lot of like, I don't know if they're movie samples or there's a lot of sampling going on. There's like a kind of an industrial quality to this record. When you kind of talk to them, what was their sort of thinking behind putting like a lot of the film clips in and different like spoken word things? Was that like just something they were just screwing around? They're like, this will be neat for this song, or was it part of like a greater vision of some sort? Or
it's always part of the greater vision. I think that wherever the samples come from, they're always going to be.
They're kind of buried too. They're not like real up. It's not like a grindcore sample where it's like
that's what I mean. It's like like layered in, like kind of like film score type stuff.
Yeah, and I think there's one of the engineers, Charlie Storm, had a part in putting those together, and where they fit in the songs and how they're layered, and they're not like just obvious kind of things.
Sure.
They're kind of almost woven into the mix of the song itself. So, but yeah, they all have a place in the song.
Now, where do you think like one of the common criticisms of this record and with this era of Dimmu in general is the sort of the sellout factor, I guess, or the that they're not true Kvalt, And I think that
what
Kvalt is
Cult?
Yeah. Well, Mark and I always like to say Kvalt because we like how hipsters have to write it a certain way. But there's obviously a pretentiousness to some of the music that they're doing, and in general with like symphonic metal, and without getting like too deep into it, I mean, where do your viewpoints kind of stand from that, like in terms of this era of black metal and the kind of things that they and Emperor and even Isan as a solo artist, the things that they were doing with music? Like, how would you combat the criticisms against an album like this from like people that think it's a little too clean, it's too big?
Well, I mean, Norwegians went through that. They went through the cult phase, right? If you look at stuff that came out in 91, maybe even 1990, 90, 91, 92, 93, 94, they went through that. Mm-hmm. They were teenagers when they were writing this stuff. They were inspired, by Venom and Celtic Frost and Hellhammer and
Tormentor.
Bathory,
Tormentor. Yeah, Tormentor was a big one. Bathory was a huge one. They went through that. So if they were to write, For All Tid 5 times, would you give a crap?
No.
And, that's the thing. If they wrote Stormblast 5 times, would you give a crap? And, these people are musicians, mm-hmm. right? First and foremost. They're not church burners, first and foremost. They're not, they don't kill, Christians, first and foremost. They're not on a anti-crusade or...
It's kind of like the Doom, the British Doom phase where, you had 3 good records and then, like, everybody's got to... go like, let's go clean vocals, let's go weird, let's go industrial. Like,
they're all trying to figure out where their musical future lies.
Yeah,
and they all want to write the same riffs over and over. Mm-hmm. So I think, you're gonna write. I think every songwriter, and I'm not one of them actually, will tell you that. I can say this about writing reviews. You're going to write some reviews that feel from a composition standpoint, like right on. You feel good about the composition, the beginning, the middle, and the end. Songwriters, I think, are also going to have that same feeling, and sometimes they're going to hit and sometimes they're going to miss. Right?
Yeah.
And
it's kind of any creative endeavor. As long as you're hitting a little bit more than you're missing, no people aren't going to notice the misses.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, one-hit wonders are a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
You're always remembered for what you hit and what you didn't. What you're not remembered for what you didn't.
Yeah.
But I mean, for as far as being cult or not is concerned, or being true satanic or Satanist, or adhering to a Satanist viewpoint or a cult viewpoint which has its ties to Satanism, I would say Dimmu embodied that entirely. They're doing exactly what they want to do. The label's not telling them what to do. The label's funding this endeavor, which happens to expose this negative. They'll say that this is one of their most negative records they've made from a messaging standpoint.
Because you said the title means
just humans in general are the most destructive species on the planet.
Yeah.
So, and being humans, we're like a cult, and Armageddon, of course, has that connotation, that destruction of all. So you can go back to the cult thing, though. I think that they already embody that anyway, but they're just writing different music. Just because you have keyboards and you're able to produce an album for a month doesn't make it any less underground or cultish or black metalish or adhering to the black metal principles as something that was produced in 3 days by Darkthrone.
Yeah.
They're doing it their way, Darkthrone. Dimmu's doing it their way. You just have different resourcing.
Yeah.
And the fact that you can play like Ozfest like they did for this record versus Darkthrone who don't want to play, those are choices they're making. Darkthrone doesn't want to play to anyone because that's their position. Dimmu wants to play to everyone. That's their position. They want to, they have almost an evangelical viewpoint on how they want to expose
the message to the masses as quickly as possible, or as efficiently.
There's that, but there's also professional aspiration as well. Whereas Dimmu views this as their livelihood. Darkthrone don't. We know that Fenris is a postman or works for the post office in Norway. He knows that Darkthrone's not going to be his livelihood. He has his day job, which is where he works, and then he has Darkthrone. I'm not quite sure what Ted does, but
Ted used to be. I thought he was a teacher at one point.
He could be. I'm not sure, but I mean, you see the difference is like Fenris goes to work every day 9 to 5 or whatever it is at the post office for Norway, whereas these guys in Dimmu are going on tour.
Yeah.
So I don't really think they're any different. I mean, if you talk to them, they're probably in the same mindset spiritually, for the most part, and that spiritual thing is probably going to be negative or satanic or individualistic, if you want to call it Satanism. Humanist. Yeah.
I don't know how many of these guys really follow the satanic doctrine anymore. I mean,
right.
Whatever that might be, but you look at guys, like dude's an emperor. They don't really give a shit about that stuff. It was a thing of the youth.
And that's the important thing to remember. I mean, a lot of this stuff, especially from the early 90s, these guys were teenagers.
Yeah, they're 16, 17, 18.
Earlier than that. Well, some of these guys are like 13, 14. So when you think about it, like what they did when they were 13 and 14-year-olds, I mean, like what Enslaved did.
Yeah.
Ivar was what, 12 or 13 when Hordane's Land came out?
Really? And then, so Viking Ligger, he was like 15 then, 14, 15.
Barely, right? Yeah. So what were you doing when you were 15?
Yeah.
You were going to the video store, renting videos, hanging out with your friends,
playing video games,
not releasing this music that we've sort of
canonized,
or we've elevated, because we talk about it because we relate to it. So it's and I want to make sure that that's kind of, these guys were also quite young, not when they wrote this album, but when they started out.
Sure, yeah.
And they're vastly different people when they were teenagers to when they're 25.
Yeah.
And then when they're 35, and then when they're 40, right? All those life stages are, make you different persons.
Well, it's kind
of how you approach music is different too.
It's kind of like the last episode that Mark and I did, for those of you that keep up with the podcast, was we talked about the Big Four and some of what they're doing and their more recent output and stuff, and it's like I listened to Lars' interview, and he was just kind of saying like there is no path for thrash metal drummers. Like we don't have a band that we can look at in their like 60s to sort of say this is what you're supposed to be doing as a thrash band in your 60s. We're like the first ones, so like everybody's looking at us to see what do you do to preserve a career beyond your goals change, your anger changes, you're just a different person, and so you adapt based on like how you mature, and you still want to take some piece of what is the core of your music, which you can still hear in Dimmu, obviously. I mean, I can still hear a lot of Enthroned and things like that in here. It's just more advanced, or they're just taking ideas further.
Yep.
And it's tough because we, as fans of the music too, we have a puritanical aspect to us as well in terms of what we expect from bands.
Sure.
And we don't always like to see them make some of the choices that they make. And sometimes we're along for the ride with those choices. And sometimes we're like, well, good luck to you.
Right.
You got to, put food on the table or whatever. But,
Sure.
So I guess, like, for me, without getting down this rabbit hole, because we kind of talked about it, where do you guys lie with this whole kind of symphonic metal or classical influences in metal? Like, where's that sort of fine line for you? I mean, I feel like it really works well on this record because there's a lot of integrity involved, because they are working. They, like you said, they wrote with the orchestra in mind. Like, they had to integrate it and things like that. Right. But you get to like your Rhapsodies and Fires, your Epicas. You're looking at what is this whole idea of symphonic metal, and
for me, I mean, I think we talked about this earlier about off podcast about having a high tolerance,
probably certainly higher than Mark does, and I'm probably just a notch below you.
Right.
But yeah, me and Chris have always been kind of opposite ends, but we always kind of meet in the middle for a lot of stuff.
Both of us always in the middle.
Yeah.
I always felt like I'm a half mix of Chris and a half mix of Mark, like kind of that weird middle ground there.
But the symphonic stuff, I think bands don't know how to use it, and I think a lot of bands sort of overuse it. So when you don't know how to use it and you overuse it, it sounds terrible.
It kind of loses its effectiveness. It's like swearing all the time.
Exactly.
You don't listen to anything.
There's a dynamic that's lost. Yeah. So if you listen to like Death Cult Armageddon and the orchestral aspects of that, and then you compare that to, I'm trying to think of something that's been very pompous recently.
Nightwish? I don't know. I go to like those kind of bands.
Nightwish, I wouldn't really talk, because I think that there's a lot of integration there.
Yeah,
even though it doesn't sound like it.
They're good at what they do for the people that really like what they do.
It's just I don't like what they do.
Yeah.
But I think Nightwish. I'm sure.
I think Michael Bublé is probably very talented
too. Opposite, where they write more orchestral and then the metal stuff is kind of slapped on.
Slapped on.
Well, not slapped on. It's probably integrated after. So I think that whereas Dimmu is more metal and they had integrated the orchestra, kind of the opposite. But I'm talking more about, pretty much any metal band that has a lot of keyboards, a lot of symphonic aspects to it, where they lose sight of the song, right?
Yeah.
Where, like Mark was saying, where you have this oversaturation of keyboard elements, this oversaturation of orchestration elements, and they kind of just become that song. And the bigger they are, the better the song is. Well, that's not really true for me, anyway. I want to hear a hook. I want to hear some melody. I want to hear some harmony. I want to hear cool riffs. I want to hear cool interplay. And I'm not talking about interplay like a Jens Johansson versus like an Yngwie Malmsteen type keyboard interplay.
Or like what Bodum does and some of their stuff. Yeah,
based off that mode. That's
exactly.
Based off
it's
the
basically
Jens Johansson thing.
Exactly.
I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that sort of neoclassical aspect to it. I'd rather hear something that sounds cool and paints a picture, because I used to be impressed by a flurry of notes, but the flurry of notes to me doesn't really paint a picture. Just kind of, well, that's neat. That's technical. That's probably really super hard to do, and super hard to do well all the time, consistently. But it doesn't really do anything for me. It doesn't at this point in my life.
It's like empty calories,
Basically, yes. Yeah, right. It's a very difficult exercise. It's a very difficult musical calculation, but ultimately for me, it's like, who cares?
And to me, you can't hear, like we're going to hear in this next song called like Cataclysm Children. You can't hear a song like that and not still think that Dimmu is fully entrenched in the black metal scene. With like the thrash, it's got the Spellbound by the Devil feel to it. I mean, it's fully committed. You can't like look at this album, even if you're not a fan of some of the symphonic stuff, and go, "Oh, these guys are sellouts." Well, not really. I mean, like they're
not John Williams or Dimmu Borgir.
Yeah, exactly. They're still doing Dimmu Borgir. Like this sounds like the stuff they did, 7, 8, 9 years before. I
think it's more palatable than the earlier stuff, to be honest. Like, I'd never want to go back and listen to For All Tid.
Those are
I think you should, but
it's not like my go-to.
Yeah, there's a few songs on Stormblast I still like, but I don't sit down and like want to listen to that whole record from start to finish very often.
And this is one of those bands too, for me at least, is like it's cool. It's like if there's like Shawshank Redemption's on TV, I'll watch it, but I don't like seek it out.
Right.
It's like I'm not like a fanatic about the band. I don't really like research much about the band. It's just like it's enjoyable.
Sure.
It's catchy. It's kind of like junk food to me, kind of.
Gotcha.
I don't feel the same way I do about Dimmu Borgir's like Dark Throne or
right.
Immortal,
Mayhem or Immortal or something like that.
Sure, makes sense.
How much influence? I mean, this is a Hall of Fame record. How much influence does this record have, like in resonance since then? Both for the band and for the scene and for like, you know.
Well, I mean, if you look at it if you look at resonance in two ways, right? What resonance can be the number of units sold, which means it has a sort of a commercial resonance, and therefore it may have a musical resonance, meaning it's going to influence the next generation of
because
musicians.
there's so many copies of it out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that black metal became much more symphonic after this. It was symphonic before because you had Emperor doing it, of course, who were probably one of the first ones to do it in the contemporary style,
to some extent.
And then, but the rest of Europe, became, especially, the northern countries, Sweden, Finland, Germany, for example, became much more enamored with this concept of symphonic whatever, right?
Power metal.
Exactly. I mean, everything became, all of a sudden, it became interesting to attach symphonic elements.
And you would trace it back to this record more than maybe ones prior to it? I'm just, not that I disagree, I'm just kind of curious.
It's probably this record is probably a trigger point, but it's probably not the avalanche, right? It's probably something that maybe have triggered part of the avalanche, and then you have other aspects of the scene that were happening at that time in 2003. Is there
an avalanche record that you can think of that's maybe not black metal that had? If we're talking about symphonic.
Well, if you look at Nightwish, for example, you brought that up. They're a very symphonic band.
Yeah.
So if you look at what record came out in 2004, 2003. Are we talking Oceanborn?
Yeah, I think it's Oceanborn. Wishmaster was before that, I think.
No, Wishmaster. Ocean. Yeah,
you guys are speaking Finnish to me.
Yeah. The only reason I know this is because I had to research this shit for that history of heavy metal thing.
Okay.
Like, I had to go and delve into this shit.
Floor Jansen and a couple other singers. Or whatever. I see it on the internet, but I don't know shit about.
So I mean, you have a band like Nightwish coming out. You have a band like Children of Bodom coming out.
Yeah, that's true.
You have bands from the States like Camelot coming out. So you have a lot of these. Forgetting Blind Guardian.
Sure, Blind Guardian was doing this stuff.
I mean, Night at the Opera.
Yeah.
Right. Or is that what it was called?
Yeah, it's Night at the Opera.
Yeah. You have these bands increasingly becoming more and more orchestral.
Yeah.
More and more integrated with sort of the opposite world of classicism, right? Of classical music. So I think there's a couple records that are triggers. I don't think there's ever an avalanche record. If there was, it's probably it would probably be something like Nightwish, because it's much more accessible than Dimmu ever will be.
Yeah. And that record was huge in Europe, and not as big here.
They're all big, and they gotten progressively bigger.
Like around here, you don't see any kind of mainstream, like radio stations don't play them, but yet if they play someplace in Michigan, for instance, it's sold out. And even like the Blind Guardian show we went to, is like, who are these people? They don't go to any other metal shows, but they love this.
Yeah.
It must be like an.
I mean, look at the Blind Guardian phenomenon in Mount Pleasant. We were selling all those import CDs for $28 a pop. Like, it was pretty nuts.
Sorry, Oceanborn was 98. I'm way off.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I thought that, and Wishmaster was like 01.
Yeah, so
2000.
So if you look at albums like Century Child and Once, Wishmaster, that was probably one of the bigger ones.
Yeah, that one I remember because I was living in Italy when Wishmaster came out, and like Italian people like their pomposity, they love that stuff. I mean, it was a huge record when I was there.
Stradivarius was also out there. I don't know, not really orchestral, but you kind of have all these little things happening at the same time,
especially in the power metal scene. But I feel like Dimmu really kind of did something.
At that point, you see there's a sort of a convergence of black metal and death metal, orchestral death metal, like Flesh God Apocalypse would kind of be a perfect example of a band that took what Dimmu did back in 2005 and are doing it now, but putting a death metal spin on it.
Got it.
And it's wildly popular somehow.
And people love it.
Yeah.
They're walking around in Victorian era, outfits, and they have this huge orchestra concept.
Steampunk, man.
In that camp a little bit now too.
Septic Flesh, yeah, I think so.
They were always kind of symphonic
before that too.
But they were kind of one of the first symphonic kind of.
A Moonspell to some extent. A lot of that stuff was kind of dramatic-y.
It was dramatic. I guess is a bit different than employing an orchestra or orchestric aspects to do the work, right?
Yeah.
So Septic Flesh became that later.
Mm-hmm.
later on. I would say they probably, Communion is probably the biggest one with an orchestra because they used a real one. Yep. But if you go all the way back to Mystic Places of Dawn, there's still some very orchestral themes on there, but I wouldn't say it was an influence because they didn't really catch on until much later on. I mean, they had the huge Natalie, who was their female singer on Fallen Temple, was an opera singer, trained opera singer.
Fallen Temple was a big record.
So
for us,
I mean, we're living
in our little microcosm world.
If you compare Septic Flesh to say Nightwish, it's a big difference.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So I would say there's a couple things happening that triggered that symphonic kind of movement or interest by bands and younger generations of musicians who wanted to marry. I want to marry deathcore with Holst. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Or kids who want to marry like necro shit with, I don't know, something a little more abstract than the guys starts with an S. It's classical. Anyway, Austrian. I think he's an Austrian composer, more abstract. But they want to do something, more noisy, almost like progressive, almost like
Morton
free
Feldman
jazz
stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
Stravinsky? Is that what you're thinking?
No, not Stravinsky.
Okay. He's not Austrian. Strauss. I'm trying to think.
Not Strauss.
Yeah.
It'll come up to me later.
Okay. Well, so we're Schoenberg. Oh yeah.
So he was a bit more.
He was like Debussy or somebody that was like a little bit edgier. Charles Ives, who was like a little bit more kind of pushing
less,
in that.
Yeah, it was a lot less symphonic and more tonal based.
Yeah, for sure. That had a huge influence on like the jazz. There was a lot like jazz people are kind of listening to a lot of that stuff. Yeah.
Yep. So cool.
Well, so we're gonna get back into some symphonic stuff here. We got Blood Hunger Doctrine, Alhelgens, Dod, E. Helvids Rike. I just butchered the hell out of that.
We need some Norwegians. Mark, who's the Norwegian guy?
I can get a hold of my friend.
But it translates to the death of all saints in the kingdom of hell, is what we got going on there.
Elegans,
and that's got more of like an old school kind of Dimmu Borgir black metal sort of feel to it. Very cool. Blood Hunger Doctrine.
That's why it's in Norwegian, by the way.
Is it because it's going back to the For Altid Stormblast kind of?
It's an homage to older records, older sounds.
Oh, that's cool.
That's why they kept it in Norwegian, to kind of keep the Norwegian spirit. They don't want to be too far away from where their original kind of sound came from. So that's why it sounds like it does, and that's why it's titled Norwegian.
Oh, I like that. That's cool.
Which all their early stuff was.
And then that's got really great Simon part in it too, which we kind of talked about the lack of Simon on this record. Blood Hunger Doctrine too, one of the things that's cool about it that we forgot to mention on Progenies is that Abath from Immortal is a big part of this record. He's a guest on a couple of songs.
Yeah, 2 songs, I think, right?
And that song, Blood Hunger Doctrine, he's not on it. He sang on Progenies, and he'll sing on a song that we don't have time to play called Heavenly Perverse. But you can hear Shagrath doing very Abath-esque stuff. It's kind of floating over the whole record, which is pretty cool. So
when Abath was known as Abath Doom Occulta.
Yes,
right?
it was.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what he's referring to, actually. It's a reference to the first Immortal record.
Because you said that Diabolical was a huge
influence on Shagrath. He loves that record.
Huh.
So he loves the everything about it. That's one of the quintessential Norwegian black metal records for him.
And you can kind of hear it on Blood Hunger a little bit too, because that's got like a doomier, dirgier feel, which Diabolical's a little bit doomier for like your modern, like kind of high speed.
Mid-pace for Immortal,
for sure. And then we're going to end with Cataclysm Children, which is a big favorite of ours, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we come back. So enjoy. That was Cataclysm Children, El Helgens Dud I Helvids Rike, or what was it? Oh, The Death of All Saints in the Kingdom of Hell, and then Blood Hunger Doctrine got us kick-started here. So we were just having some laughs off mic as I was explaining to them all the douche flute playing that goes on in my school with vaping in the bathrooms now, and I tell the kids that we call it the douche flute, so we're having some laughs. There's a douche flute dance that goes with it. I'm trying to shame kids into stopping vaping. Yes. You know, I want them to be like real rebellious kids. Like, go smoke in the parking lot.
Go cut yourself.
Yeah, do something cooler than, like, you know, making the shit and piss smells in the bathroom smell like strawberries, you know. Yeah. So it's just really society's on a downward slope. So
yeah, there we go.
But so we're kind of wrapping up things here. And Chris, you know, it's been really awesome to have you. You know, we've kind of gotten off script from the album a little bit, which, you know, again, this is, I think, an album that you're either going to really be into, or like you either like Dimmu or you don't. There's not like a lot of middle ground there, but I think you kind of know based on the sort of song selection that we've thrown out whether or not it's a record that's going to be to your liking or not. But I think it's been cool to like explore some of the background stuff with this record. Is there any kind of last stories that you gleamed from doing the Hall of Fame that you think would be kind of interest, you know?
Let's see. So, you know, this record has the Bathory cover on it.
Okay.
Satan My Master.
Yep.
Which was a Japanese bonus track at the time. So some pretty funny stories about that. You know, Nick Barker played that in the dark in his underwear. And then Simon...
To get the mood, or...
it's just something Nick does when it's the final song of the final session that he's doing. He'll always record that in his underwear in the dark. Just something.
Just a ritual. Yeah.
It's his ritual. He does it, and, you know, off goes his pants, and next thing you know, he's drumming in his underwear.
Been there, brother. Been there. Off go the pants.
Right. Usually after work.
Yeah.
At work. Yeah. So, and then I think Simon said that on the Satan is my Satan My Master song. If you listen to the drum roll, it's actually pasted on top. Oh. Because if you're a drummer, and Mark is a drummer, if you listen to the way the hi-hat's going, it's an impossible tom roll. He calls it the impossible tom roll, right? Because the hi-hat's going, which means that, you know, you couldn't do this tom roll.
Yeah,
exactly. So that's a funny thing that I don't think a lot of people know, just because it's not a lot of things that kind of get out there.
Yeah, sure.
And then one is, and if I remember correctly, I'll have to look it up real quick, but when they recorded the orchestra in Prague, they recorded it at a different hertz. So they recorded the orchestra. Hold on a second, I'll find it.
It was like 40 and 42 hertz or something.
440 or 442.
Yeah. So they recorded at 442, and the guitars are tuned to 440. So they had to spend 2 weeks just changing the orchestral to match the guitar tune in hertz. So it took them about 2 weeks to finish that, to figure that out. Otherwise, the orchestra would sound in a different range than the guitars. They wouldn't sound as integrated. It would sound kind of a bit off, almost like someone's had a speed up on the orchestra, where or the music would have a slight slowdown effect. Almost like on
a record player where you can mess with the pitch control.
Exactly, or you can, if you touch the record, it slows down a little bit. You might have that effect on it. That was kind of an interesting thing. That they had to go down. They had to kind of adapt to that 2 hertz, because they couldn't have the orchestra do that, right? Because they already recorded the album, or they were almost done recording the album, and then the orchestra couldn't. They have 52 people. They can't all adapt to 2 hertz.
No.
So it's really that was
easier to record it and then go in the studio and then pitch
They didn't realize they did it, actually.
Oh, gotcha.
So when they got back to the studio in Sweden, Frederick Nordstrom, I guess, had to be the one to sort of say, let the cat out of the bag, that this isn't really compatible, right? The orchestra recordings to the music recordings, the metal recordings, aren't really compatible, so they had to do a lot of editing to make it work.
Jeez, that's funny.
Yeah, so that's pretty cool. Well, and then I think the last thing is when they were talking about Abbott coming in to record guest vocals. He wasn't really part of the original plan, but Shagrath always has an affection for Abbott's vocals. So he came into Gothenburg, and they recorded a bunch of vocals, only some of which you hear on the record. So there's a huge chunk of vocals that Abbott recorded that are never going to appear on a record. So it's kind of.
Do you think they'll ever be on those demos that they're going to put out?
Probably not, because the demos are fully realized before he's not even on the demos.
Got it.
Right. But what they did say is that, basically came in, he recorded his stuff, and then they just spent the rest of the time like partying their balls off.
Yeah, did he say they made the producer puke?
Yeah, as far as Frederick, I don't know why he puked. I mean, there's probably a story there too.
Yeah.
But he made Frederick puke. So he just said whenever he's around, he invites trouble.
The Bath is a drinker.
Yeah,
hard party, hard living.
Yeah, so. when he was in Philadelphia at one point, when the first time he brought Immortal over for I believe it was the East Coast Metal Fest that Jack Koshik put on in Pennsauken.
Brian went to that one with you. I didn't get a chance to go.
He was in Philly, and he was at this place called Tattooed Moms, and he was totally drunk, and he was just like running across all the top of the booths, like they have where you eat, people eating in booths. He was running around on top of them, like doing his black metal poses and shit like that. Unfortunately, no one has a video of that because cell phones back then were pretty rare. But it's a good story to hear. Here's one of black metal's leading lights running around a Philadelphia bar on the top of a booth, or on the posing with his invisible oranges. So to speak.
Awesome. Well, we're going to end with kind of an appropriate, I think, song that really synthesizes all the things that we've been kind of talking about, because really the first couple minutes of Eradication, Instincts Define, is almost purely orchestral before the metal sort of stuff comes in, because we had debated on whether or not to play one of the orchestral versions of this or Progenies, but you don't really need to, because you can really hear what the pureness of the orchestra without kind of the band on top sort of sounds like in the intro here. And it's
you can go look at it on the internet.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
hear it, I guess.
And that's the Eradication has the was part of the Hellboy trailer.
Oh, okay.
So you had both Progenies and
Eradication. Yeah,
in the Hellboy.
Yeah, this is incredibly cinematic. The way you hear this song.
So apparently the band were in Texas when they were releasing that trailer, and they didn't know that it was actually the trailer was coming out. So they were telling me that they went to see some movie in Texas, and then the trailer comes on, and they're like, they're sitting there in the movie theater with a bunch of people, and then they realize that that's their music.
That's their song. Wow.
Yeah.
Do they get paid?
Huh?
Do they get paid?
Oh, I'm sure they got a royalty of some sort for that.
I should hope so.
Yeah, I hope so.
For that use, whatever film usage. Sync, I think it's called a sync license. But they said they kind of walked out of that movie feeling kind of proud that they had nobody even knew that it was these black metal musicians from Norway had written this piece of music that then appeared in a Hollywood production.
Sure.
So that's pretty cool.
Very cool. So thank you, Chris, for joining us once again on the episode. We hope to maybe get you to record something else with us down the road here, and
not wait 5 years.
Not wait a bunch of years here. So, so thank you.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
No problem. And so for Death Cult Armageddon from Dimmu Borgir, which will be, by the time this podcast is up, should be out in Decibel as a Hall of Fame record.
Yeah, was it the March issue or something? It'll be here.
I think it's the next one. Probably January.
It's going to be the one after Pallbearer. So that was the Pallbearer cover with Saxon Hall of Fame.
Which is out as we're recording this.
Just out now. So I assume that it will be the March one.
Yeah. Very cool. Very cool. So for Eradication, Instincts Define, and Dimmu Borgir, I'm Jason.
I'm Mark.
I'm Chris.